In the fall of 1907, New York City, the beating heart of American finance, was coming undone. It started with a failed stock scheme, then a few nervous customers lining up outside bank doors. But within days, those few customers had become a panicked nation, and the financial capital of the United States was teetering, threatening a devastating financial collapse. This was not some faraway crisis. It was unfolding in real time, in the marble halls of Wall Street, in the smoky offices of trust companies, and in the trembling hands of everyday Americans watching their life savings vanish. America's banking system, still young, fragmented, and dangerously underregulated, was being exposed. The foundation that supported the country's growth was crumbling beneath its feet. It all traced back to an ambitious move gone wrong. In October of 1907, a group of high-stakes investors attempted to corner the market on United Copper stock. They believed they could drive the price sky high by controlling the supply, then sell for a fortune. It sounded like a great plan, until it completely backfired. The market didn't bite, prices collapsed, and the United Copper collapse exposed the era's unchecked market, shaking confidence in banks tied to risky ventures. A single failed bet could unravel an entire financial network, as depositors began to doubt the safety of their funds. And suddenly, the banks that had financed the scheme, banks that had lent millions on a bet, were exposed. And that is when the panic began. It started with just a trickle, only a few depositors withdrawing funds from banks rumored to be involved. But oftentimes, fear spreads faster than facts. In a system built entirely on trust, all it takes is a few people at the front of the line to make thousands question everything. Within just a few short days, lines stretched down the sidewalks of Manhattan, customers demanded their money, and cash reserves quickly dried up in the panicked frenzy. Then came the fall of New York City's third largest trust, the Knickerbocker Trust Company. Its president had been linked to the copper cornering scheme, and when depositors caught wind of it, they pulled their funds with terrifying speed. The doors were shut, the vaults were empty, and once Knickerbocker fell, it was all downhill from there. Regional banks across the country, now sensing danger, began yanking their reserves from New York's institutions to protect themselves. Liquidity vanished and loans evaporated overnight. Businesses could no longer make payroll, and entire sections of the economy, railroads, steel, coal, completely froze in place. What had begun as a bold bet on a single stock was now threatening to pull down the entire American financial system. And the worst part, there was no safety net. There was no Federal Reserve, no central bank to inject cash into the system. No federal deposit insurance to protect the savings of millions of Americans. The Treasury Department had limited tools, and political leadership was slow to react. The independent Treasury system, meant to safeguard the nation's gold and currency, was rigid, slow-moving, and quite frankly, incapable of stopping the bleeding. With no central bank to flood the system with cash, the nation was left defenseless against cascading financial failures. A single bank's collapse could ignite a depression, leaving millions vulnerable to economic ruin. By late October, the New York Stock Exchange itself was on the verge of shutting down. Its near closure threatened to paralyze America's capital markets, halting investments and trade. Such a collapse could ripple globally, cementing New York's fall as the world's financial epicenter. Several of the city's biggest banks were days, perhaps hours away from failure, and if they fell, they would drag the entire national economy with them. Railroad companies were already defaulting, brokerage firms were hemorrhaging capital, the price of credit skyrocketed, if you could even find any. Across the country, ordinary Americans began lining up outside their local banks. Some carried small bags, hoping to withdraw just enough to get through the week. Others carried everything they had. It was more than a financial panic. It was a psychological one. A full collapse of trust in the banking system. The kind that leads not just to economic hardship, but to chaos. The collapse of trust could spark more than economic ruin. It risked social chaos. with desperate crowds potentially turning to unrest. Behind closed doors, New York's banking elite were paralyzed. Some argued for waiting it out, others begged the federal government to step in. But with no plan, no president, and no leadership from Washington, there was only one question left on the table: who would stop the bleeding? If no one acted, millions could lose everything. Companies would close, railroads would shut down, factories would go dark, and unemployment would go through the roof. Panic could spread to the streets, and the still young American financial system might never recover. And then, from deep within his private library, one man rose to the challenge. He wasn't president, he didn't hold public office, but he may have held more power than anyone in America. And at that moment, he knew the fate of the entire economy rested on his shoulders. Before the Panic of 1907 swept the nation into chaos, let's step back to see how a shaky financial system set the stage for a crisis of this magnitude. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson made a bold move, or rather, it was a calculated stillness, letting the Second Bank of the United States charter expire. It was the final blow in his war against the national bank. However, by letting it expire, he plunged the nation into a perilous void without a central bank to steady its financial pulse. Jackson's war on the national bank left America's economy vulnerable, with no central authority to tame wild swings in money supply. This void fueled a cycle of booms and busts, priming the nation for the 1907 disaster. In New York City, the money supply fluctuated with the seasons. Pushed and pulled by the country's agricultural cycle, each autumn a stream of cash was spent to purchase harvests, leaving the city's financial reserves gasping. To lure funds back, interest rates spiked, a move that drew foreign investors like moths to a flame, their gold flooding New York to chase these large profits. From its peak in January of 1906, the Dow Jones Industrial Average soared to 103. The market then began a sinister retreat, a slow bleed that gnawed at the confidence of Americans throughout the year. Then, in April, the San Francisco earthquake destroyed the city, unleashing chaos that siphoned a ton of money from New York to fuel desperate reconstruction. Estimates suggest around $100 to $150 million. For context, that's worth a staggering $3.5 billion today. The earthquake's financial toll crippled New York's banks, as funds were sent out west to rebuild a shattered city. This drain left Wall Street's reserves dangerously thin, unable to withstand the storms that were brewing. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the Bank of England tightened its grip, hiking interest rates as UK insurers hemorrhaged payouts to American policyholders, keeping funds tethered to London shores. By July, stocks had crumbled 18% from their January heights, clawing back half their losses by September. Yet the market's heartbeat remained unsteady. The Hepburn Act, unleashed in July 1906, empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to cap railroad rates, gutting the value of rail securities, which was the lifeblood of Wall Street at the time. By slashing railroad profits, the Hepburn Act sent shockwaves through Wall Street, eroding the value of securities that anchored investments. This blow weakened banks and investors, paving the way for panic. From September to March 1907, the stock market staggered, shedding 7.7% of its worth, only to plummet another 9.8% in a brutal 2-week collapse from March 9th to the 26th. It was a so-called rich man's panic that hinted at darker days in the near future. This rich man's panic exposed cracks in the financial elite's confidence, as stock losses bled their fortunes. This early tremor hinted at a larger collapse, threatening to engulf the entire economy. The summer of 1907 simmered with volatility. Each shock a hammer blow to the national economy. Union Pacific stock, a cornerstone of collateral, crashed 50 points. A New York City bond offering withered in June. The copper market imploded in July. And in August, Standard Oil reeled under a staggering $29 million antitrust fine. By September's end, stocks had hemorrhaged 24.4% for the year. It was a grim prelude to the upcoming catastrophe. Beyond America's borders, tremors rippled. Bank runs shook Egypt in spring, Japan in early summer, as well as Germany and Chile by the end of October. Global bank runs drained capital from New York as foreign investors turned inward to shore up their own markets. This international squeeze left America's financial system exposed, teetering on the edge of a worldwide crisis. As autumn loomed, the banking system braced for its perennial trial, a season when even the slightest jolt could unleash ruin. The stage was set for a panic that would test the nation's fragile financial soul. As I mentioned before, the Panic of 1907 didn't begin with a bank failure, it started with a scheme. At the center of it was Augustus Hines, a bold copper magnate who had built a fortune in the mines of Butte, Montana. Hines had made a name for himself by battling Eastern industrialists and winning. And by 1906, he was ready for the big stage. He moved to New York City and quickly fell in with Charles Morse, a Wall Street operator notorious for once cornering New York City's entire ice market. Together, Hines and Morse built a powerful empire. Between the two of them, they held board seats on 6 national banks, 10 state banks, 5 trust companies, and 4 insurance firms. It was a staggering amount of influence concentrated in just these 2 men. Hines and Morse's vast network of banks and trusts gave them immense sway, but it also tied the financial system's fate to their risky schemes. A failure in their empire could unravel confidence, threatening institutions nationwide. But that wasn't enough. The Hines brothers, Augustus and Otto, had one more play in mind, and it would push the entire financial system to the brink of collapse. The target was the aforementioned United Copper Company, which the Hineses believed they already controlled a majority of. Otto was convinced that a large number of United Copper shares had been borrowed and shorted by speculators, meaning that traders had sold shares they didn't actually own, expecting to buy them back at a later date for a lower price. Now Otto saw this as an opportunity. If the Hineses could buy up the remaining available shares, they could trigger a short squeeze, which would force the short sellers to scramble to cover their positions, sending the price of shares sky high, making the Hineses a lot of money in the process. Short squeezes were a hallmark of Wall Street's speculative frenzy, where fortunes oftentimes hinged on market manipulation. A miscalculation here would not only ruin the Hineses, but also ignite a panic that would engulf the nation's banks. But before they could begin, Otto needed capital to fund it. The Hines brothers and Morse met with Charles Barney, president of the Knickerbocker Trust Company. Barney had helped finance Morse's risky ventures before, but this time he hesitated. Morse warned that a squeeze of this size would require far more capital than Barney had access to. So Charles Barney, heeding the warning, wisely refused to fund the plan. Otto, however, disregarded Morse's words and proceeded with the scheme anyway. On Monday, October 14th, he launched the squeeze, buying up shares aggressively. The price jumped from $39 to $52 in a single day. Encouraged, Otto went even further. On Tuesday, October 15th, he issued the call, demanding that short sellers return their borrowed shares. The price then shot up to nearly $60. But Otto had made a major miscalculation, and it was about to cost him dearly. You see, the short sellers weren't trapped after all. They were able to find United Copper shares elsewhere, through other investors, through institutions Otto had overlooked. The Hineses had severely misread the market, causing the price to collapse soon thereafter. United Copper closed Tuesday at $30, and by October 16th had fallen to just $10 per share. United Copper crash obliterated fortunes and exposed the web of speculative lending. Its fallout threatened to drag down banks and trusts, unleashing a crisis that could freeze the nation's entire economy. Otto Hines was financially ruined from this failed scheme, but more importantly, a national fallout was about to ensue. What had started as a stock manipulation scheme had now become a confidence crisis, the type of crisis that shattered the illusion of Wall Street's stability. And without trust, banks could collapse, strangling credit and plunging the nation into economic chaos. The failure of this squeeze called attention to the fragility of banks, trusts, and investment firms tied to the Heinz-Morse network. Customers quickly began pulling their money out. Rumors swirled around institutions that had seemed rock solid just days before, but were now facing dangerous levels of withdrawals. And the Knickerbocker Trust, having been merely approached for funding, soon found itself at the center of suspicion. Knickerbocker's mere association with the scheme turned it into a lightning rod for panic, as depositors feared for their savings. A run on this trust giant could topple others, paralyzing the heart of American finance. The crash of United Copper was more than just a bad bet. It was the first domino in a long line of overextended banks, anxious depositors, and dangerous connections, and it had just tipped. In the aftermath of the United Copper debacle, Otto Heinz stood at the edge of ruin. His scheme to corner the market had backfired so spectacularly, it left him unable to meet his debts. By October 17, 1907, the New York Stock Exchange delivered a fatal blow, stripping Otto of his trading privileges, as his brokerage, Gross and Kleberg, crumbled into bankruptcy. Otto's banishment from the New York Stock Exchange was a stark warning of Wall Street's intolerance for failed gambles. His brokerage's collapse shook investor faith, hinting that more firms might fall, dragging the market deeper into chaos. The shockwaves reverberated far beyond Wall Street, though. In Butte, Montana, the state savings bank, owned by Augustus Heinz, and entangled in United Copper's collapse as collateral for its loans, teetered and eventually fell, declaring insolvency. The fall of Heinz's Montana bank revealed just how New York's failures could devastate distant communities. This collapse threatened to unravel the fragile ties between regional and national banks, pushing the crisis well beyond Wall Street. Its ties to New York's Mercantile National Bank, where Augustus held the presidency, tightened the noose around his empire. The image of failure clung to Augustus Heinz. The board of Mercantile National, reeling from his connection to the failed United Copper scheme and now the insolvent Montana Bank, demanded his resignation. But the clock was already ticking toward national chaos. Word of the collapse spread like a wildfire, igniting panic among depositors who stormed Mercantile's doors, clawing to reclaim their savings. The frenzied runs on Heinz and Morse's banks exposed the panic's contagious fear, where rumors alone could bankrupt institutions. Such mass withdrawals risked strangling credit, leaving businesses and workers across the nation in peril. The bank clung to solvency for a few desperate days, but its reserves dwindled under the onslaught. Yet the crisis did not stop there. Fear also seeped into the institutions linked to Charles Morse, Heinz's shadow ally. Runs also erupted at Morse's National Bank of North America and New Amsterdam National, as depositors fled, fearing the whispers of reputations now ruined by the failed scheme. The New York Clearing House, a powerful group of the city's banks, watched with growing dread. To shield the teetering financial system from the stain of Heinz and Morse, forcing both men to sever all ties to their banking interests. The Clearing House's ruthless purge of Heinz and Morse bought precious time, but it exposed America's dependence on private bankers to avert disaster. This stopgap measure only delayed the inevitable, as deeper flaws in the system loomed. By the weekend, the city held its breath. No systemic panic had erupted, yet. Funds yanked from Heinz's banks found refuge in other New York institutions, which acted as a fleeting calm before the storm. But the tremors were spreading, and within a week, regional stock exchanges across the nation began to buckle. Pittsburgh's exchange slammed shut on October 23rd, locking its doors for 3 months as fear gripped the heart of America's markets. Pittsburgh's exchange closure sent shockwaves through America's industrial heartland, freezing capital and trade. Such regional collapses threatened to plunge the nation into a deep depression with no end in sight. And yet, the worst was still to come. In the dawn of the 20th century, trust companies soared to dizzying heights, their coffers swelling with a staggering 244% growth in assets over the decade before 1907. National banks, by contrast, grew a modest 97%, while New York state banks trailed at 82%. The meteoric rise of trust companies made them pillars of American finance, but their lax oversight hid a fatal flaw. A collapse in one could unleash a domino effect, imperiling the nation's economic foundation. At the helm of these high-flying trusts stood titans of the city's elite, financiers and socialites whose names were synonymous with great wealth and therefore power. The shadow of scandal still loomed over the Knickerbocker Trust Company. Tainted by past ties to the disgraced Charles Morse and Augustus Hines, Barney faced a reckoning. Knickerbocker's links to Hines and Morse turned whispers of scandal into a death sentence, as depositors questioned its stability. Such ties threatened to poison the trust in the entire financial system, fueling a runaway panic. On Monday, October 21st, as whispers of depositor unease swirled, perhaps sparked by withdrawals as early as October 18th, the Knickerbocker's board delivered a fatal ultimatum: resign or watch the institution completely crumble. That same day, a crushing blow landed. The National Bank of Commerce, under the iron grip of JPMorgan, declared it would sever its role as Knickerbocker's clearinghouse, effectively cutting off its lifeline. This act not only sealed the trust's fate, but also amplified fear, pushing the financial system closer to collapse. By October 22nd, a frenzied mob besieged Knickerbocker's doors. The New York Times captured the chaos with an article saying, "As fast as a depository went out, 10 people and more came asking for their money. 2 vanloads of cash arrived in a desperate bid to stem the tide, but the crowd would not be appeased. Directors shoved through the crowd, pleading that all would be paid. Yet in under 3 hours, a staggering $8 million was withdrawn from the vaults. By noon, Knickerbocker buckled, forced to halt operations as its reserves vanished." Knickerbocker's downfall sent shockwaves through America's financial core, proving no institution was untouchable. Its collapse froze credit, threatening to plunge businesses into bankruptcy and workers into despair, with no safety net to break the fall. Banks and trusts, now gripped by fear, slammed shut their lending windows. Interest rates for brokers on the stock exchange skyrocketed to a ridiculous 70%. Stock prices plummeted to lows unseen since December of 1900 as liquidity evaporated. The 70% interest rates and plummeting stocks signaled a market in freefall, strangling brokers and investors alike. A prolonged collapse risked shattering New York's global financial dominance, dragging the world economy into the abyss. Then came the fall of 2 other giants, Trust Company of America and the Lincoln Trust Company, engulfing them in its wake. The panic's relentless spread of these trust companies revealed a financial system on the verge of implosion. Each new run drained the lifeblood of commerce, pushing the nation toward a depression. By Thursday, October 24th, the financial landscape was a graveyard of failures. 12th Ward Bank, Empire City Savings Bank, Hamilton Bank of New York, and First National Bank of Brooklyn all lay in ruins, victims of a crisis spiraling towards catastrophe. As trust companies continued to crumble, a new storm now loomed over Wall Street, threatening to topple not just trusts or banks, but the New York Stock Exchange itself, leading to complete disaster and chaos. Only one man could stem the tide of the collapse. His name was JPMorgan. Now, despite just receiving millions of dollars from the United States Treasury, reluctance still gripped New York banks. They refused to give out short-term loans that greased the wheels of daily stock trades, starving the financial market in the process. The bank's fear-driven refusal to lend choked the lifeblood of Wall Street, as brokers now faced ruin without funds to trade. A frozen market could halt investments nationwide, threatening America's economic engine and its global standing. Prices on the New York Stock Exchange quickly plummeted, spiraling as liquidity vanished. On October 24th, around 1:30 p.m., the president of the exchange, Ransom Thomas, burst into JPMorgan's office. The exchange faced imminent collapse unless it closed early. Now, JPMorgan understood that this would be a disastrous move. The stock exchange's impending collapse threatened to shatter America's financial backbone, paralyzing industries reliant on stock market capital. Without Morgan's intervention, a shutdown could have plunged the nation into a prolonged economic abyss, dragging global markets down with it. So around 2 p.m., Morgan assembled the city's bank presidents into his office. He laid out what needed to be done to avoid this disastrous collapse. Unless $25 million was raised in the next 10 minutes, as many as 50 brokerage houses would crumble. And by 2:16 p.m., 14 bank presidents had raised $23.6 million, a vital lifeline for the exchange. Morgan's $23.6 million rescue was a desperate act of financial heroism, staving off market collapse. Yet it exposed America's reliance on a single financier, fueling calls for a system to prevent such crises in the future. The funds flooded the market at 2:30 p.m., just in time to salvage the day's trading. But by 3 p.m. close, $19 million had already been deployed, but it was enough to stave off catastrophe. As Morgan emerged from his offices that night, he broke his usual silence, delivering a rare statement to the press, saying, "If people keep their money in the banks, everything will be all right." But the dawn of Friday, October 25th, fresh terror surged anew on the exchange, threatening to unravel the calm facade. Morgan rallied the bank presidents once more, but this time, their resolve wavered. They only mustered $9.7 million, a fraction of the previous day's pledge. The faltering $9.7 million pledge underscored the bank's dwindling resolve. Without sustained support, the market's survival hung by a thread, risking a deeper economic spiral. With the exchange once again on the brink, Morgan made a tough call. This $9.7 million would not be used to fuel margin trades, meaning when an investor borrows money from a broker to buy stocks, using the purchased shares as collateral, aiming to amplify profits, but risking losses if prices were to fall. Morgan understood the major risks of continuing these types of trades in this scenario, so he temporarily cut them off. This bold move to halt margin trades was a calculated strike against reckless speculation, aiming to stabilize a teetering market. While it curbed chaos, it also choked off trading vitality, delaying the market's return to normalcy. Despite the overall number of trades on this day slumping to only 2/3 of Thursdays, the most important takeaway was that it managed to survive another day. As the financial storm raged on, JP Morgan, James Stillman, George Baker, and the rest of New York's banking elite faced a grim reality. Their coffers couldn't sustain endless rescues. Even the U.S. Treasury's reserves were quickly dwindling. To calm the anxiety, they turned to public faith. On Friday evening of October 25th, the bankers forged two critical alliances. One committee to enlist clergymen in soothing their Sunday congregations, urging calm, and another to brief the press on the rescue plan's intricacies, projecting stability. By rallying clergy and the press, the bankers waged a battle for the public's trust, aiming to calm the fear, fueling the panic. A failure to restore confidence could have unleashed relentless bank runs, plunging the nation into a deeper economic abyss. So needless to say, this was a vital step to restore economic security and confidence throughout the nation. To keep funds flowing, the New York Clearinghouse unleashed $100 million in loan certificates on Monday, October 28th, enabling banks to settle balances while preserving cash for frantic depositors. The $100 million in loan certificates was a lifeline for banks, freeing cash to calm frantic depositors. Bolstered by sermons from pulpits and reassuring headlines, a fragile order returned to Wall Street that day, with banks' balance sheets fortified. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou, sensing the tide turning, agreed to return to Washington, signaling to markets that the worst was over. Cortelyou's return to Washington was a bold declaration that the crisis was waning, aimed at steadying jittery markets. Yet a hidden crisis still loomed over the nation. On Sunday, George Perkins, Morgan's trusted ally, learned that New York City was on the edge of bankruptcy. Needing $20 million by November 1st to survive, the city's attempt at a bond issue had collapsed. Unable to attract buyers, New York City's looming bankruptcy was a dagger to the heart of American finance, threatening to cripple the nation's economic hub. Its collapse could have sparked chaos in markets and streets alike, plunging the crisis into uncharted depths. On Monday and Tuesday, Mayor George McClellan pleaded with Morgan for help, determined to protect the nation from the catastrophic fallout of a municipal default. Morgan stepped in, committing to buy $30 million in city bonds, a bold move to stabilize the city and the markets. Morgan's $30 million bond purchase was a monumental gamble to save New York City and stem the panic spread. Yet it simultaneously cemented his grip over America's financial fate, raising uneasy questions about one man's power to shape a nation's destiny. But at this moment, the country didn't have the luxury of time to find another option. Thanks to the investment from JPMorgan, New York's financial pulse steadied by Saturday, November 2nd. But once again, a new threat emerged threatening Wall Street. Moore & Schley, a giant among brokerage firms, was now on the brink of collapse, crushed by massive debts secured against shares of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company, also known as TC&I. Moore & Schley's looming ruin was a ticking bomb that could shatter Wall Street's fragile recovery. A forced sale of TC&I shares risked plunging markets into chaos, threatening to undo all efforts to quell the crisis. With TC&I's thinly traded stock buckling under relentless selling pressure, banks stood poised to call in Moore & Schley's loans come Monday, forcing a fire sale of shares. Such a move would send TC&I's value crashing, dragging the brokerage into ruin in the process. JPMorgan, undaunted, summoned another counsel to his library that Saturday morning. A daring plan emerged from their meeting. U.S. Steel Corporation, forged by Morgan through the union of Andrew Carnegie's and Albert Gary's steel empires, could absorb TC&I, rescuing Moore & Schley and halting the crisis. U.S. Steel's bold acquisition of TC&I was Morgan's masterstroke to save Moore & Schley and steady the markets in the meantime. Yet it flirted with antitrust violations, pitting economic salvation against the era's fierce battle against monopolies. U.S. Steel's leaders weighed two paths: lending Moore & Schley $5 million or buying TC&I at $90 per share. Hours of tense deliberation stretched past 7 p.m. that night, yet no deal was made, and the meeting dissolved. Meanwhile, fears were mounting that Trust Company of America and Lincoln Trust might not open Monday, bled dry by relentless depositor runs. That evening, 40 to 50 bankers once again converged on Morgan's library, splitting into different factions. This time, clearinghouse bank presidents in the East Room, trust company leaders in the West. Morgan, tackling Moore & Schley, retreated to the librarian's office. There, he issued an ultimatum. He'd bolster Moore & Schley, but only if the trust companies united to save their faltering peers. Morgan's iron-fisted ultimatum forged a $25 million lifeline for the trusts, averting their collapse. As midnight neared, talks stalled. Morgan doubled down, once again declaring that $25 million was needed to prop up Moore & Schley, but he would commit nothing unless the trust companies committed to resolving their own crisis. The trust executives, realizing Morgan's aid was conditional, faced a stark choice: fund their own bailout or risk total collapse. By 3 a.m., roughly 120 bank and trust officials gathered for a grim reckoning. Trust Company of America barely clung to solvency. but Lincoln Trust was short by about $1 million to cover depositor accounts. As debates ensued, the bankers discovered Morgan's ruthless gambit. He had locked them in the library, pocketing the key to force a resolution. By locking the bankers in his library, Morgan wielded his authority, forcing a resolution through sheer will. He warned that failing to provide the $25 million to save the weakest trusts wouldn't just doom the failing trust companies themselves, but rather the entire banking system, leading to a devastating economic collapse. After hours of persuasion, he finally broke the resistance. At 4:45 a.m., the trust company's unofficial leader signed the agreement, spurring others to follow. With the deal secured, Morgan released the exhausted bankers. Sunday afternoon saw Morgan, George Perkins, George Baker, James Stillman, Elbert Gary, and Henry Frick laboring in the library to cement U.S. Steel's acquisition of TC&I. By nightfall, a plan took shape, but one hurdle still remained. President Theodore Roosevelt, a fierce trustbuster hell-bent on dismantling monopolies. Henry Frick and Elbert Gary raced overnight by train to the White House, desperate to persuade Roosevelt to waive the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was created to outlaw monopolies and anti-competitive practices to protect fair markets. U.S. Steel already dominated 60% of the steel market, and the deal could draw scrutiny. After arriving in Washington, they were barred by President Roosevelt's secretary. They enlisted Interior Secretary James Garfield to secure a meeting. With the stock exchange's opening bell looming, Roosevelt and Secretary of State Elihu Root grasped the catastrophic stakes of a market crash. Roosevelt, pressed for time, relented, later reflecting, "I had to decide instantly before the exchange opened, as any hour could prove fatal. No one could fairly fault me for not opposing the purchase under such pressure." Roosevelt's reluctant waiver of antitrust laws was a desperate bid to save the markets, prioritizing survival over principle. Yet it bolstered U.S. Steel's dominance, sparking fierce debate over the cost of bending laws to avert disaster. When news of the approval hit New York, confidence immediately surged. The Commercial and Financial Chronicle heralded the move, saying, "The relief from this deal was immediate and profound." The final crisis of the Panic of 1907 was vanquished. In the wake of the Panic of 1907, where JPMorgan's iron grip on America's financial system saved the nation from collapse, a growing unease began to simmer. His outsized influence orchestrating rescues from his library exposed a troubling truth in American economics. A handful of bankers wielded unchecked power over the entire U.S. economy. Fast forward now to the year 1912. This unease erupted into a congressional reckoning known as the Pujo Committee, a probe that would lay bare the inner workings of a so-called money trust and reshape the nation's financial future. Formed in May 1912, the House Committee on Banking and Currency, chaired by Representative Arsen Pujo of Louisiana, was tasked with investigating the concentration of financial power in the United States. The Pujo Committee arose from a nation still shaken by the Panic of 1907, determined to uncover the hidden hands controlling its wealth. Its probe threatened to dismantle the financial elite's dominance, igniting a battle for America's economic soul. Spurred by public outcry over the 1907 panic and earlier crises, the committee sought to uncover whether a group of Wall Street tycoons controlled banks, trusts, and industries, stifling competition and democracy itself. The investigation, driven by the committee's chief counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, zeroed in on the interlocking relationships among New York's banking elite, with JPMorgan at the center. Over 9 months, the committee summoned many financial giants to testify, none more pivotal than JPMorgan himself. In December 1912, Morgan, now 75 years of age, faced Untermeyer's relentless questioning in Washington. Morgan's clash with Untermeyer was a spectacle of power under siege, as he defended his empire against charges of greed. The hearings gripped the nation, turning public sentiment against Wall Street's unchecked might. The hearings probed Morgan's role in the 1907 panic, his firm's influence over major banks and corporations, and the web of interlocking directorates where a few bankers sat on multiple boards, combining power over railroads, steel companies, as well as financial institutions. Morgan staunchly defended his actions, insisting his motives were patriotic, not predatory, and that his power stemmed from trust and character, not conspiracy. Yet Untermeyer's sharp interrogations painted a darker picture. A financial oligarchy where Morgan's firm, alongside allies like First National Bank and National City Bank, controlled vast swaths of American commerce. The committee's findings, released in February 1913, were nothing short of shocking. The final report confirmed the existence of a money trust, a concentrated network of financial power dominated by Morgan and a small group of bankers. It documented that 18 financial institutions led by JPMorgan and his associates held 341 directorships across 112 corporations, controlling assets worth over $22 billion, when the total capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange was around $26.5 billion at this time. The money trust revelation stunned America, exposing a web of control that choked competition and risked public savings. This bombshell report fueled a clamor for reform, threatening to unravel the financial elite's stranglehold. This web extended to giants like U.S. Steel, General Electric, and major railroads, revealing how a few men could sway entire industries. The report also highlighted practices like stock watering and speculative manipulation, which enriched bankers while also risking public savings. Though the Pujo Committee lacked authority to prosecute, its revelations shocked the nation, fueling demands for reform. The report's findings amplified calls for stronger oversight of Wall Street, directly influencing the passage of landmark legislation. In 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act, establishing a central banking system to reduce reliance on private financiers like Morgan during crises. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, building on the Sherman Antitrust Act, further curbed interlocking directorates, weakening the grip of financial networks exposed by Pujo. The Federal Reserve and Clayton Acts were seismic shifts, curbing Wall Street's unchecked power and safeguarding the economy. Born from the Pujo findings, they marked a new era where government, not tycoons, would steer financial stability. The committee's work also laid the groundwork for later security regulations, including the Securities Act of 1933. JPMorgan, battered by the hearings and public scrutiny, died in March of 1913, just weeks after the report's release. Morgan's death, mere weeks after the Pujo report, closed a chapter on his financial reign, as a nation was left questioning his legacy. The committee's expose ensured his era of unchecked power would give way to a more regulated future. The Pujo Committee, though overshadowed by subsequent reforms, marked a turning point, exposing the perils of concentrated financial power and igniting a movement to democratize America's economy. Its dramatic clash between a congressional probe and Wall Street's most powerful remains a pivotal chapter in the nation's battle to tame unchecked wealth.